Put it in there. Okay. I'll tell you the same thing I told Pat. I said, either go sit down or you have to teach a class. 9 o'clock, time for us to begin. Thank you so much for being here. What a beautiful, bright, warm, sunshiny day out there. Somewhere. Maybe not here, but it's okay. Watching the news last night, the weather actually, and what they're saying about some of the northern states and the amount of ice that they're going to get, and bad weather and cold temperature, which we're going to get that likely here. But I've learned, you said it, I've said it, all of us have at one time or another, but it's a true statement that we probably should pause, consider, and then be thankful. I even said it to Bryce this past week in a text. The phrase of, it could have been so much worse. For him, the weather could be so much worse. When I walked out of the house early this morning and that wind hit me, and I saw that it was raining or misting rain, I thought, I wonder if that's going to be icy. And it wasn't. It could have been worse. So we're thankful, and thankful for each of you being here today. I think it was about 9:30 last night when I finally closed the computer down at the house and finished what we're going to study in this Bible class. I've had to spend more time at the house this past few days, set up kind of an office there. So Dawn has had 4 or 5 hard days, really bad days, sick at her stomach, extreme, debilitating headache, holding her head. And I told Linda and Jay that she probably has had more medicine this last week than she's had in a month, trying to get it under control. She did have a pretty good day, a better day Friday, but yesterday was another bad day. So she's home, and Lord willing, I'll be, as soon as the service is over this morning, I'll go back and take care of some lunch and try to get that down her. She hasn't been eating. Even her coffee and her famous Rice Krispies. For 2 days now, she refused to eat that. And so I've had to pretty well get stern and make her do the rest. But just doesn't want to eat. Randy, lead us in our opening prayer, please.
Loving Father, Holy God, we're grateful to come together, focused on your word. May we be nourished spiritually. May we, Father, concentrate on your word and learn lessons that we would from that we can from these even Old Testament characters who were your servants. We pray, Father, that you will be with us as a congregation in this new year, that we will resolve to always keep you first in our lives and focus on doing what we can to bring honor and glory to you. We pray that you will be with those around us who are not able to be with us today. Sister Estelle and others that I may even able to make it. Please, Father, help them with their health issues, that they can have better days here here. We're thankful, Father, that we have the promise that we are faithful to the finish, that we will go home to be with you in eternity, where there will be no pain, no sorrow, no parting. Help us to strengthen our resolve each and every day to honor yourself Please forgive us when we fall short. In Jesus' name.
Amen. Where'd Randy go? Randy, if you will bring me one of the 3 sheets. I didn't keep one up here. I'm going to do something in our Bible class. In 60 plus years of preaching, I've never done this. I've never taught a whole class. LaDon said something one day this past week about, what are you studying? I said, I'm studying about the ites. She looked at me funny, like, are you kidding? Is that a joke? I said, no. The Amalekites, Ammonites, Moabites, all of those ites. As a further foundation for our study, I'm going to take the time that we have as we walk from creation to eternity. Thank you, sir. From creation to eternity. And I want us to look at about 4 or 5. I want to give you some information on each one. It has caused me to dig, to try to put it together in a sensible form. The book, the biblical analysis that I've referred to 2 or 3 times, a 1935 edition, was probably the most concise and sensible way of looking at it. So I pull from that a considerable amount. For the Leon Stancliffe and the Gospel Messages commentary set, 27 hardback books, I pulled from it. For the Wayne Jackson and also in Christian Courier, as well as Apologetics Press, and their unimaginable amount of material, information. If you want to study, and if you want information on a particular matter or topic, it's available. So it's not any genius on my part at all in any way on any of the material that we have presented here, but it's just a combination of what we're trying to do to organize. Richard even mentioned several days ago the fact that he liked very much how we're kind of tying those together and what nation and which one came from what lineage. I looked a few moments ago, instead of me going over there, I was looking just a few seconds ago over on this side where it's talking about the 2 daughters of Isaac and the nations that came from that. And over on Jacob here in this side of the lineage from Adam all the way down to Christ. Today's class is not something that we will probably do again. Probably ever, maybe not in my lifetime, ever will I teach a whole class on just the national information about different nations and how they went against each other, fought against each other, were friends with each other, or enemies of each other. But at least to kind of have it where we can see and kind of trigger thoughts. We're still in the middle part of Genesis. But as we start in Genesis 37, it's about Joseph. And Genesis 37, all the way through the end of the chapter, or book rather, chapter 50, is basically about Joseph and his actions. One of the very first things that happens with Joseph is his brothers don't like him, envious, jealous of him, put him in a hole in the ground, and merchants come by. Do you recall who they were identified as? Who the brothers sold Joseph to? What? Ishmaelites. That's one of the words. Midianites is also found, one of the words. Now, is that a contradiction? This study of what we're going to do right now will help us further clarify in our minds. Many times it was referred to based on where it started and then who followed and what nation resulted. So that's where we're going. I hope that it's worthwhile. I do not have, since I finished this last night about 9:30, I do not have a lesson sheet on this, but if you desire, I'll try to put one together where you might have it as a reference point if you don't take notes from it today. There's no order, particularly, as to which one we're doing first. So we picked the Edomites. First of all, in Genesis 21, Ishmael is not the son of promise. Isaac is. Ishmael is Abraham and Sarah's son. Hagar's son, rather. Sarah took it on herself to bring Hagar into Abraham. Ishmael resulted from that relationship. And thus, Ishmael was Abraham's son by Hagar. Instead of just casting him aside, God said, Genesis 21, I will make of him a great nation. There's been thoughts and questions in my mind at different times. Others have written it as well. Since it was not God's plan, why does it seem as if God blessed Ishmael? There's various presumptions, thoughts, ideas. I'm not even going to share any of them. Yours will be as good as theirs or mine or anybody else's. But God's mercy and grace extended to Ishmael, who himself did nothing wrong. And Sarah may have been trying to do the will of God through Hagar to be kind and generous. But he said, I'm going to make of you a great nation. The Edomites were the descendants of Ishmael and Esau. I mention them both because it is from that lineage or that side. And it fulfilled this promise of I will make a great nation. And some of the names I may mispronounce, and if you want to try them, you're welcome to do that instead of me. But it fulfilled when Bashmath and Mahalath, daughters of Ishmael, the daughters of Ishmael, married Esau. In other words, from the nation of. Now, if we can look at a side note of that, there are times, we had one this past Wednesday night and made reference to it briefly, where God, when the family is looking for a wife for Isaac or whoever it may be, and God specifically says not to get a wife from Canaan. It's interesting, and the power of God behind the scenes, as it were, leading man in the right direction, especially to maintain the lineage of Christ. Abraham's promise of from thy seed all nations shall be blessed. But to kind of look at all of these things flowing together. So it's going to be a tedious class. It's not going to be the most interesting from the standpoint of like Abraham was offering Isaac or various other great incidences, but maybe the foundational material will help. One of the commentaries, I forgot now which one it was, made the statement that hereditary tendencies. What do I mean by that? Yeah. Who the mom and dad are, what they did, as we can see in Adam and Eve and Cain and Abel. Both Cain and Adam and Eve did not obey the will of God. Concerning Esau especially, we see someone that was not a spiritual person, but was more worldly, carnal. I struggle with the words. I pulled it from 2 or 3 sources, and revengeful. In Genesis 16, though, concerning Esau, in verse 12, it says, he shall be as a wild ass among men. His hand shall be against every man, and every man's hand shall be against him. That's pretty well, not just pretty well accurate decision. It is very accurate, and it reflected what he would be and was in the later years of his life. With Genesis 17, we have, I have blessed him and will make him fruitful, will multiply him exceedingly. God saying about him. At first appearance, it might seem contradictory. How he's going to be a wild man, everybody's going to be against him, and I've blessed him, God says. But God, and again, I'm not trying to speak for God or explain God. I can't do that, either one of those. But we know times, and witnesses have witnessed in our readings, where God has taken someone that was rebellious and turned him into someone very positive. He didn't give up on them here. He gave them time to grow. Peter in the New Testament is a classic example, denying Christ, other things that he did. But God saw what Peter would be, could be, and ultimately became. And very likely, this would be similarly in that approach. The Edomites declined. Some nations lasted a long time, others did not, was very frivolous, and because of various reasons, declined. And concerning that, the reasons that we might hear is that vengeful, revengeful. And the spirit of revenge is evident in Esau and how he hated Jacob. Jacob had defrauded him. He wanted to get even. He was very angry still. It was also where they refused to allow the Israelites to pass through their territory, the land of the Edomites. And we can go and do a deeper dive in Numbers chapter 20, Judges chapters 11 through 17, and 2 Chronicles. It's interesting how many books overlay the information that we're reading in Genesis that will be explained later in the Old Testament and even referred to in the New Testament. But Esau's vengeance, as well as just their downright refusal to let them pass through the land. We can add to that the conspiracy against Israel. In other words, here was a mindset. They joined hands with the Moabites, Ammonites, and even the king of Zohab and the Philistines in the conflict against Saul. We can go to 1 Samuel chapter 14, read more details about it, and how they were even taking hands with enemies. I remember hearing a statement. I don't even remember now the subject, or I think it was having to do with people, not nations. But the statement went something like this: your enemy is my enemy, thus we're friends. You ever seen that happen? I have in people. I don't like that man. Somebody else says, I don't either. And these two become friends, conspiring, as it were, or taking action against that one that both of them don't like. That's similar to what took place here. Then also the vengeance that was done to Judah, found in Joel chapter 3 and Ezekiel chapter 25. If we really, I know it would be even further, slow down and monotonous a little bit to do a historical study, we could plunge into all of these things and see a spirit of vengeance. Well, Don and I and our family lived in St. Louis. That was back in the 1970s. early 80s. There was an extension of Freed-Hardeman College at that time, I believe it still was, became a university. An extension there where they offered classes, college classes, in local congregations. LaDonna and I took one of those classes that was called Church History. You want to know the embarrassing part? I almost failed it. It was tedious. It was very tidbit fact information, and I didn't resonate with it. It wasn't that it wasn't interesting. It was because it would involve those that I cared about in the Bible and nations that I cared about, but it's being able to answer some of the questions. And if I can cast a little bit direction, the tests were not on what we'd studied in class. That made it even more difficult. It doesn't matter, but I'm giving you a background of what we're looking at here and the decline of the Edomites. But what caused them to fall? Their demise. Their decline, their fall is documented in Scripture. They were completely subdued by David. We can read in 2 Samuel and 1 Kings. Nebuchadnezzar also, in Jeremiah chapter 27, subdued them. Israel and their possession of Edom is even foretold. In other words, the land that was theirs is not going to be theirs. Israel's going to possess it. We find that again in Numbers, Book of Psalms, Ezekiel, and Isaiah. Isn't it interesting that even the prophecy of the land that they would have is mentioned in 4 different Old Testament books? The fall is predicted in rather significant detail. We find that in Jeremiah chapter 49, 15, 20 verses. I mean, God gives us the information concerning how they will fall, be destroyed. And basic fact, Edom is never to be permanently restored, according to the first 4 verses of the book of Malachi. The remnants of the Edomite nation exist in the Arabians and their kindred. I hope that part of what we do in our class, and I'm going to have to hurry up because I'm behind already in time. I hope that what we do is lay a little bit of a foundation that will give us understanding when we hear newscast concerning certain Israelites, Arabians, Iraqians, etc., and know a little bit of history behind it. All right? With an economy of time in mind, let's go to the Midianites. Joseph was sold to the Midianites. The Midianites were descendants of Midian, who was the son of Abraham by Keturah. Over on the right side, you can see the various wives of Abraham, and Keturah is one of those wives after Sarah died. The Midianites, and you're going to find this in 2 or 3 of the ones that we'll mention even today, they were pretty closely related to the Hebrews. But the known history as far as the Midianites are concerned is very short. It is almost parallel to the Hebrews' history. The location is mentioned in Judges chapter 7. The book of Judges is an awesome book. Joshua and Judges parallel, follow chronologically to each other. But it's a time of man's history that is disconcerting, alarming. In the very opening chapter, in chapter 1 of the book of Judges, people are faithful. The influence of godly men has had such an influence on them. Even the elders that followed after other leaders remained faithful. But in chapter 2 of the book of Judges, we read there arose a generation that knew not God. That's chapter 2, verse 10. So what we're finding is the Midianites, as well as some of the others, we find literally they're pulling away from, or contrary to, or even viciously against God and his people. As we mentioned a moment ago, they were the descendants of Midian. I believe the first reference of which I know is when Joseph was sold to the Midianite merchants. That's verses 25 and following in Genesis 37. It's the first that I was able to determine. But they're known as a distinct nation was when Moses fled to Midian. That's found in Exodus chapter 2. If we had a chart, a map, to be able to see, and we could see where Moses fled to, we see where they came from, and how all of this can kind of mesh together. Zipporah, that's the wife of Moses, and Jethro, the father-in-law of Moses, they were Midianites. It begins to help us to see a little bit of their background and their mindset, because the Midianites and the Hebrews were significant conflict between the two. That's Numbers 22, 25, and 31 chapters, that is, in their conflicts. They're going to war. They're trying to triumph over each other. But they rose in power, and Israel became their servants. Found in Judges chapter 6. Keep in mind what we just said a few moments ago against Judges. But Deborah, well known, Deborah delivered Israel from that servitude in the campaign with Gideon at the height of their prominence, the Midianites' prominence. They were powerful. But Deborah was instrumental in freeing, setting free, we would call it redeeming, the Midianites, or rather Israel, from the Midianite servitude. And with that particular event, Deborah's delivering them, they passed out of sight in history. Basically, no more to be seen. That is the Midianites. Let's think out loud just for a moment of the lessons. Not so much lessons, maybe, as it would be the interest that we should have in the Midianite nation. First of all, they're related to the Hebrews, but like the Edomites, the Moabites, and Ammonites, they were enemies of the Hebrews, especially in the latter part of their history. They were enemies, but they joined hands with the others. And because of joining in, they became very prominent, very powerful. But the history of the Hebrews triumphs. And it would be incomplete without the knowledge of the conflicts with the Midianites. The triumphs of the Hebrews. We've got to be able to put it together and to see what nations become allies with each other and go against Israel, and the conflicts brings it all about. One additional point is the history of the Midianites clearly, I love this point, clearly demonstrate that the plans of God cannot be overthrown by military power. Multiple of the commentaries and or scholars, the books that I've consulted, brought around it full circle and pointed that out. It was not just military power. I remember a little town called Ai. God's people was going to go and capture them. Got defeated. They didn't even send very many soldiers. They didn't think it was necessary. They were defeated. The military power or prowess is oftentimes not what's taking place, but rather it is God who will not be overthrown. His will be done and has always been that way and will continue to be that way. The Midianites met destruction while fighting against God's people. That's important. We can read about them. We're going to talk about them as we get further into Genesis. I want us to be able to go back in our minds and say, yeah, that's what we were talking about earlier. All right? For an economy of time now, my time's getting away quick. Ammonites. They descended from the son of Lot by his youngest daughter. Over on this chart right here, you can see the two daughters, and literally the first daughter and the second daughter, and the descendant of that interaction. They parallel, the Ammonites parallel very similarly to the Moabites. We'll get to that in just a moment. It is connected with the history of the Hebrews. And they're actually related. See, this is where, to me, it gets a little fuzzy, a little cloudy. I'm not so sure about what each one and where and all of that. And maybe that's not mandatory that we sort it out to that degree, but we pull out of it what will ultimately matter. They were the original inhabitants of the land. They were giants. That's always intrigued me, even as a teenage boy years ago. Giants? Oh, yeah. Do you remember the Philistine giant that came out in the valley and charged everybody? If you put out your greatest man, I'll fight him, and whoever wins, the other serves us. The Goliath that David slew. There were giants. The Ammonites, like the Moabites, were prohibited from entering into the assembly of Jehovah forever, according to Deuteronomy 23. And their final destruction resulted from their hostility, again, toward the Hebrews. Let's note a couple of three things. For an example, they joined Edom and Amalek to smite Israel and capture Jericho. They were defeated at Gilgal. They besieged Jabesh Gilead when Nahash, their king, threatened the inhabitants with a severe penalty. Again, all of this you can pull out, you can take the time to read. It would take us 3 or 4 hour classes, 45-minute classes, to go and to read these scriptures where this is kind of capsule. They were even overpowered by Saul. They joined with the Edomites, the Ammonites did, and the Moabites and attacked Jehoshaphat. But they were totally destroyed, look at it, by each other. Jotham reduced them to tribute, and David referred to them as enemies. Again, just trying to pull a brief overview of, as I pointed out a minute ago, their demise because of their actions. But it's interesting. The only restoration spoken of them is in reference to their acceptance of the gospel as individuals. The foretelling in Jeremiah, Isaiah, and Zephaniah, and whatever remnants that may still exist or left of them, they will have free access to the gospel of Christ. You see, when we're studying about nations, one against the other, vengeful actions, destructions, etc., they lived under a different law. The law, the new covenant, the gospel of Jesus Christ in which we live, the age, the Christian age we call it, the church age we call it, and it is retrospective. Yes, it dealt with those that lived in Jerusalem on the day of Pentecost, and many of them obeyed the gospel. But these that had lived before could not obtain forgiveness of sins. Yearly, they would just merely have their sins roll forward. But the death of Christ went backwards too. And thus those that were Ammonites as well as others, the remnants of which the gospel of Jesus Christ was applicable, accessible to them. That is extremely important that we emphasize. Even as we look historically through the nations and through the different ones and all of the different ones that made mistakes, Abraham lying and things of that nature, but he's listed in the Hall of Faith in Hebrews 11. Why? He was right with God. He was a friend with God. I believe he asked forgiveness, as it were, and rolled that forward, and it was blotted out. That's why he is listed. By faith, Abraham left his home. By faith, Abraham offered his son. He was obedient. He made mistakes. But just like each of us was able to have that sins washed away. All right? Let's look at the Moabites. He was a descendant of the son of Lot, of his oldest daughter, as I pointed out over here. That's another story I don't have time to get into, but they went unto him, etc. But these, again, the Moabites, were continual, perpetual enemies of the Hebrews. And it's closely connected to the Hebrews as far as their history, what they did, where they were, etc. But being an enemy toward Israel is listed as much as we're able to determine as the chief cause of their decline and fall. I can pause at this point and elaborate significantly on how it would easily be possible for us to be lost because we hated somebody. It would be easy for us to be so focused on vengeance and retaliation and responding to what they did that was wrong to us. I don't even care if they had a reason for them being their enemy. It is this obsession that caused their decline. We can read in Amos and also Jeremiah how God punishes them for their sins, and it's spoken about in detail. In Jeremiah chapter 48, Jeremiah gives us an insight as to their faults. They trusted in their works. They trusted in their treasures. They were at ease in Zion, as we find in other references. They were greedy. They were boastful. They trusted in a God, lowercase God, not Jehovah God. You're talking about foolish? You're talking about tragedy? Here was Jehovah talking, dealing, trying to help, pleading through the prophets. They turned a deaf ear and followed another God, man God. Their fall was at the hands of Israel. Isaiah chapter 11 tells us. The land of Moab, Moabites, just like that of the Edomites, it was to be made desolate, according to Zephaniah. I'm sometimes maybe I stretch it too far. I hope I'm not. But coming to my mind is Galatians chapter 6, the New Testament. What does it say? Paul, writing to the church at Galatia, tells him, be not deceived. God is not mocked. Whatsoever a man soweth, that shall he reap. We see that in the book of Galatians. We see it back here with the Moabites and the Edomites. We literally know that maybe our interest, our concern, it's interesting, Ruth, a servant of God, a Moabite. The Arabians, that's our concern maybe, are their descendants who still manifest even today an intolerant spirit. So what do we learn from all of this? Some of you may very well be sitting there thinking, well, that was time wasted. I think not, if we will merely hold some of that information in mind. And the Midianites, merchants that bought Joseph as a slave from his brothers, and then brought Joseph into Potiphar's house. And during a famine, it was Joseph, over all of the things of Potiphar, that helped maintain a living, life-giving food for the land. But it was the Midianites that got him there. God uses other nations, even those that are not godly, even those that are enemies, to sometime bring about his will. Was Joseph just accidentally over all that Potiphar owned? Not at all. You see, God, and that precious word, providence. Joseph and Esther, probably my two favorite stories in all of the Bible that demonstrate God's hand. In Esther 4, for an example, you're here, Esther, for such a time as this, to save your people. Joseph, you're here. You've been brought here, as it were. God's hand was in that for such a time as this. 7 years of plenty, 7 years of famine, and they would have died. Even Joseph's own family survived because he was serving a living God. And the lessons that we can learn from this is God is truly in control. Question: Does God work providentially today? Absolutely. He is the sustainer. He is the one that is in control. He will not be mocked even today. Now, does he deal with us directly as he did back then? No. Does he talk to us directly as he did back then? No. But he has spoken to us through his holy word, this great book of God, and he's told us even prophetically of what took place then to help us to see that just sheer military power is not going to triumph. It's God's will that will triumph. So if we get nothing else of the many things out of it, we can know we're not to trust a man-made God. We're not to be greedy. We're not to be boastful. We're not to just sit back and be at ease, but rather zealously, diligently doing everything that we can, the will of the God that created the universe and is in charge of it. And the God that will one day judge us. It's a powerful lesson. We'll pick up there, Lord willing, and look back at our lesson on Isaac and conclude that. Get to Jacob and Esau pretty quickly. May even get, I never know how far I'm going to get each particular session, but I've already got material here on Jacob and Esau that I want us to look at, Lord willing, as well, either this morning worship or at the 5 o'clock worship.